And I'm just going to launch into today. So just reviewing the general agenda. So yesterday we set the stage, we laid the groundwork for this workshop. For those of you that were able to attend, hopefully you enjoyed the presentations as much as I did, learned something about drought and preparing for training exercises and your agency or your program. Learn more about the Central Indiana Water Study and how they're using data to understand how much is available, how much can be accessible, and then different ways we can come up with water shortage plans, mitigation plans, preparedness plans, etc. So today, what we're going to do is hone in more. We're going to take advantage of all of your expertise, all of your experience. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is a kickoff meeting. So we have been very intentional in inviting each of you to this because you are in a position to really understand what the situation is across the state, particularly what your agency or program does in Indiana, to know where are the biggest impacts. And yesterday's presentation from Trent, he reiterated that it's unlike a tornado where you can sit there and say, clearly there's a tornado, clearly it's heading my way, clearly it's gone. With drought, it's very difficult to know, yes, it's here, these are the impacts, because it really is for each person, each audience, each agency. So for us to try and move Indiana into the next stage of drought preparedness and planning, we want to understand what are all the key impacts that Indiana faces when there is a drought. So we'll be thinking back to past droughts and trying to see, so what were the biggest impacts there? Which ones were we prepared for? Which ones were we not really prepared for? Which ones do we think are the highest priority because they might have the biggest trickle-down impact across the state? And then how do we take this information in terms of impacts, prioritizing the impacts, challenges we face when trying to be prepared or even establish a plan of preparedness for those impacts before we go to the next step. And that next step could be you going back to your agency and program and discussing this and saying, so how can we now work more proactively, not only within our program, but with other programs that we met during this workshop or are aware of. But additionally, how do we translate this down now to the more local municipal level in the later workshops that we hope to have in June and July. So there are currently 27 of us. What we will do is essentially break out into rooms, because if you remember yesterday, people were pretty quiet and we really want to hear from all of you. We want to take notes on what all of you have to say so that we can compile those notes and have a statewide picture of the issues. Once we come back from these discussion sessions, if you will, we'll return as the main group and try and figure out, so did this work? Did this not work? What questions were we addressing and trying to cover during these breakout times? And then how can we take that information that we did identify and take notes on and translate that down to a more local level? So let's see. I have gone through that before. Oops. My whole screen. I hit the wrong button. I don't know if it's all blank for you guys. Before I break into that, however, I want to do another Mentimeter to try and help us prepare. So pull out your phones while I'm trying to figure out how to do all of this. And where's my Mentimeter questions? Okay. So again, you on your little device, go to menti.com. We have the code at the top of this screen that I hope you all can see. And the first question is, when was the last time your agency or organization was actively involved with a drought situation? hopefully this one won't have the informational bias that the one yesterday had, because it's totally up to, when it was. So I see we have 13 participants out of our potential 27 or so. See if we can get a few more in here. But it looks like the majority is within the past 12 months, and that might be because Northern Indiana just can't seem to get out of our abnormally dry or moderate drought conditions. So hopefully as you're answering this question, you are thinking about, so when was the last time we were involved? What was the situation? Was it the Northern Indiana situation? Was it the 2012 flash drought? Was it something else in between? And what role did we have? And what were the impacts that we were essentially reacting to or trying to get ahead of? All right, 20 is a good number. Let me now go to the next one. And this is the same question, but related to flood. So when was the last time your agency or organization was actively involved with a flood situation? And this is always kind of tricky because obviously flood and drought are you would think, well, they're total opposite. Why would I ever deal with these certainly at the same time or not? But sometimes if you are following an extended drought period, that will deplete the land in such a way that just one heavy rainfall event could cause flooding situations because you have compromised the vegetation that was perhaps holding the moisture in place. So there often can be relationships between flood and drought. We got 17. I feel like last time we got up to 20, and that was pretty exciting. Quiet, folks. All right. I won't kill you guys with waiting and waiting. So let me now try and go back to the presentation slide. All right. You can see the presentation slide?
Yes.
Yes, awesome. All right, so I want to just again go through a little bit more. I feel like, where am I here? Apologies. Yes. Of what these different breakout groups will be. So when I am finished going through this kind of preparatory slide so that you know what you're getting into, Hans will warp all of us into separate breakout rooms, and you'll be put into a breakout room led by one of us on the planning team. And you'll start off by first reflecting on the effects of past drought. So you'll be thinking about when was that past drought? You just participated in that survey online on your phone, wherever. And in thinking about that, you're going to identify where were the drought impacts that were relevant to your community, to your agency, to your response teams. And this could be anything from, well, parks were impacted, to we had to deal with wildfires, to we had water quality issues. So there's going to be one of the longest lists you've ever seen that the moderator will scroll through and really hope that you will speak up and participate and say, yes, this was a significant impact. This one really wasn't. Because the idea is we're going to go through and almost checklist all of these impacts, maybe take notes on some of these impacts. We're also going to take note of who were the key stakeholders that were impacted by this. So even though you are probably most affiliated with the program or agency that responded or tried to react to the impact, we're going to think of, but who were the people that were impacted by this on the ground? Who members of our community? And then we're going to take about a 20-minute break, though that's totally up to the moderator at that point, because this will be a very deep exercise. take a mental break to try and reflect on everything. And then we're going to come back and we're going to think about those impacts. And then we're going to, within your group, try and prioritize those impacts. Try and figure out what were the top 6 or 8 that rose to the top. And you're going to have considerations of this, such as these happen all the time. And this is, something that happens so often and has such a significant impact that we need to prioritize that. Or this impact has such a large spatial extent, or it's in a location that is a high at-risk community, so to say. Maybe they're dependent on well water. Perhaps it's the speed of onset and the availability of warning for that particular impact that is why you want to prioritize it. Potential severity of consequences to others, but also things like, well, the impact itself may not be that bad, but when that impact occurs, it really leads to a lot of cascading events. So the more we can prepare for that initial impact, then the more prepared and proactive we can be to prevent all the cascading events. And then finally, once you have those key impacts that you think are the most essential that are impacting people in Indiana, you're going to go through and figure out, so what are the biggest challenges, though, to being more proactive against having these impacts occur? Is it a lack of tools? Is it a lack of resources? Is it a lack of coordination with key partners? It's like you see the impacts or where are the impacts, but you never know who to reach out to try and get on board with all of this. So after then you complete that, we will warp you back into the main room and reflect on the exercises. Obviously, we'll have notes taken from the moderator, so we could do some sort of report out, but I think what I'm more interested in is, so what did we learn from doing the exercises themselves? How could the information from those exercises help to populate, say, or enhance the next version of a water shortage plan? And where do we go from here? So I know we have some great attendees today, and for those of you that may not be in Indiana, you certainly are welcome to participate in these discussion groups. It might be very useful to hear what the impacts are in Indiana and so forth, but I also understand that since this is very Indiana focused today, if this isn't something that will fit in with your best time management, then that's great. Understand, and hopefully we'll see you back tomorrow. But for those that are in Indiana, please don't go scurrying away thinking, breakout day, I can't do this, because we really do want to hear from you. Sometimes we hear from the same players all the time, and it's critical that we hear from voices that perhaps we don't always hear from. So with that, planning team, is there anything I forgot to mention that you think might be pretty critical before we all get warped away?
No, I was just going to mention, Hans and I were talking, and we are going to do 3 groups. So there's about 8 people per group. So just joining some just because of the numbers. So just a heads up for everyone.
Okay.
And you, Beth.
Yes. And so as soon as we see the moderators we're perhaps teamed up with, we'll figure out who's taking notes, or we both are.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
You'll be by yourself, Beth, and I will be with David, and I'm going to moderate, and then Manuela and Ryan will be together. And I said they could figure out who they would like to moderate.
Okay. Sounds good. So with that, Hans, are you ready to warp us all to our separate, making it through those 2 breakout sessions? I know the first one probably made you really reconsider sticking through after the break, but hopefully the second part after the break, I won't even say second half, because for us it was a bit shorter, was a little bit more gratifying to be thinking forward and thinking about more of the issues and potential solutions that could be involved. So this last part of this morning in today's workshop, so this will be about a half hour to 45 minutes till we get to the top of the hour, we'll now be reflecting on the exercises. It could be of, well, what did we learn and so forth, but where do we go from here? So I'm going to try to share my screen, because we're going to try and do this through Mentimeter. I apologize for those of you that are like, I have had enough of this Mentimeter situation. But I feel like there's a couple advantages to doing Mentimeter. One, you all can give your 2 cents, your opinions in complete anonymity. Whereas if you were just going to put it in the chat box, we'd all know who you were. So if you really want to be completely frank and say, Beth, your laugh is the most annoying thing I've ever heard in the world, and everything else is fine, but if I hear you cackle one more time, I'm going to scream. You can actually put that in there, and we have no idea who you are. So let me try and advance this. Additionally, it will help sprinkle, if you will, discussions where I might perhaps call you out if you are so willing. If I see something that looks really good on there, then I'm like, hey, I want to hear more about that. And finally, it's all preserved. So we have a record of what all of you think. That way you all feel like you had a voice and you didn't have to be passive or submissive to the big talkers. So the first question that we're asking you is, what did you discover or even learn about Indiana and drought when you were doing the foundational exercises? So we intentionally tried to mix each of the groups. So it was a combination of federal people and state people and perhaps university people. And hopefully that meant that you were getting to interact with those that you weren't always interacting with. So was there any benefit that you got from this or discovery? And the dogs are getting ready to bark. So I'm going to mute for a second, let people put up their thoughts. You can read through them, and then we'll talk through it as a It's around 20 of us I think that are sticking around. So we're going to try and get this number of participation up there, because I want really to hear from all of you. I don't need to know who you are, but I want to hear from all of you what your thoughts were. All right, we got up to 18 so far. Ooh, 19. Teamwork. It makes the dream work. Yeah, and the virtual world has added a challenge to this. However, I love the anonymity part that would have been hard to do, perhaps in an in-person.
Well, and it would have been really hard to gather a group like this for 3 days.
Yeah. Yep. All right, so we got all the way up to 21. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to share your thoughts. So the first couple things I was reading in the boxes seemed to be, wow, there's a lot of different people, a lot of different perspectives. And I know even in our group, it seemed like there were a lot of participants that were on the water side of things, but maybe not so much on the fire, forest, wildfire, and or even ag. So when we tackled the ag questions, it was a lot of not necessarily head scratching because we had some surface understanding, but I think it would have been more beneficial for us to even learn what some of those issues were. So I think that that was a fairly common thing. So there were folks that apparently had more ecosystem habitat folks in their group, which was great. Look forward to reading those notes. And the participation, well appreciated. Networking. Planning team, do you guys have any thoughts or comments on what you're seeing and reading?
Beth, it's pretty consistent with what I think was discussed in our group. You know, I think there's definitely lots of comments that could be lumped together. So pretty good input, consistent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just seeing that there is a diversity of issues is justification to try to consider regularly updating drought plans so that they are as inclusive as possible, but continuing to expand the collaborators on the drought plans to make sure that representation is really being heard across so many different sectors. And a lot of times when we were going through our exercise, I imagine you guys felt the same thing. And the other groups is so many of the categories were interrelated. So it's like, well, you have this groundwater problem. Okay, but how do you relate that to well water problems? And how do you relate that to just water supply problems? And I'm like, isn't that all kind of the same? So you see this interrelationship. Maybe it's different, but yeah, maybe it doesn't mean that this is just too big of a problem to solve. All right, let me go to the, yeah?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to mention, I think one thing that kind of came out in our group, at least for me, is that it was really helpful to hear, thinking about the who and who's affected, who to engage, especially at the more local level as we have, more focused workshops on regions. I think there's a lot more people that we can get in the room, hopefully, to talk through some of these. I think that was helpful just to think through, the organizations that could be invited and hopefully attend.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Anyone want to add more context to what they posted up here? Beyond just the planning team? I mean, if you posted something like, hey, I want to really get my 2 cents heard. Mm-hmm. Or 5 cents because we've had inflation.
It seems like the intersectionality is a good observation, and when moving forward in planning, looking at those sort of Venn circles that intersect and maybe solutions that could affect more than one sector would be ways of prioritizing things like bang for the buck kind of approaches.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sally.
I also think kind of building off of that too, and it didn't really come up in our group, but not just thinking about, action solutions that can affect more than one sector for drought, but in a specific sector, thinking about solutions that could also help other hazards like flooding. I think maybe is there a way to kind of have more than one hazard that could be benefited by those actions?
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? All right, let's check out what the next question is because even I don't remember. Here we go. Back to your phone or favorite device. What else should have been asked within these foundational exercises? It's kind of hard to think what you didn't see and maybe your mind is distracted, but would there have been an exercise that could have been done that would have been useful that we just didn't have time to do or chose not to do? That could have helped with our proactive intentions for the state?
Beth, I don't know where you would put this, but I think one of the pieces that we might have been able to use was the differences throughout the state. Northern drought is different from a southern drought, and it often is regional. It's like we've talked a lot about the northern drought. We haven't really experienced that to the same degree in central Indiana, nor in southern Indiana. So I think thinking about how the different physiographic regions respond is a good place to start for the state.
So that could be a good idea when we do go to the sub-state workshops, is maybe doing it more geographically than sector could be important.
Right. I mean, there's a really natural break into three big physiographic regions.
So I know this is a tough one, really making you think.
Yeah. Because I think that's a major point, because, you know, we could divide the state into 3 or 5 different climatic zones, which we have certain indices for, but there may be the regionalism and the impacts that we're not even kind of monitoring or measuring, you know, comparatively.
These are all great ideas.
So Dave, I think that's going to be the case. I mean, if you think about northern Indiana, if you think about the highly altered Kankakee Basin, it is much more sensitive to droughty conditions than, say, the Elkhart River system, where they haven't done the same degree of modification to their wetland areas.
Exactly. Yes.
So northern Indiana is not one tight unit, but there's some very pronounced regional differences.
Yeah, because we've organized all our data, and I'm talking about like long-term comparison, so we know what the anomalies are, to larger scale areas that don't take into account those, you know, kind of regional factors. You know, we have a whole climate division that we go back to 1895, but that's nice, but it doesn't delineate between the subbasins in that area.
So let's see, maybe data sets that are collected by state agency that could serve as drought indicators. Tune in tomorrow for sure, because we'll
Exactly.
have a bunch of presentations on that. It may not be fully inclusive of everything that is available, but hopefully that will provide a good foundational exposure to what tools are out there, because a lot of different groups are providing different resources.
Hey, Beth, do you mind if I actually had written that one, which I think it's a slightly different spin on, so not drought indicators in particular, like veg dry, all that stuff. What I meant by that one is, are there state agency data sets like reservoir levels, cattle, you know, or livestock herded, that sort of thing, that are collected by various agencies in Indiana, that you could sort of analyze with different drought indicators to identify like the impact of drought? So really more doing like a data analysis of, and then, you know, of the state agency data sets. And then perhaps beyond that, once it's identified, could you use those to monitor drought conditions and sort of the impact that drought is having? So it was not necessarily just the data sets, but the impacts that, you know, could be experienced by the state.
That makes sense. Yeah, because I know as we were going through the different categories in the first exercise, it was so we think the CAFOs are impacted by this in this way. We, you know, it seems like it's more just climate change issues than drought issues. But if we had, and maybe it's out there, we just aren't familiar, but a lot of information on the impacts of CAFOs and other agricultural sectors across the state, and then can correlate that to different levels of drought, types of drought, et cetera, then maybe that would help us better understand the different impacts on drought to that industry. And then that could apply to many others. Maybe good. Yeah, if we send out the exercises in advance, then you all could have certainly looked it over, and maybe that first section could have gone faster. How effective was an agency's response to the drought? You could have heard what other teams talked about. So we could do a report out. For me, that's almost an agonizing part of breakout sessions, but also just for the sake of time. But certainly feel free at this point, if there were key things that came up in your meeting that you want to share with the group. I think that would be useful. I'd hate to do a rundown of all the different categories and topics that we discussed. I know we did for ours, instead of thinking about specific issues, whether it be prioritizing impacts and challenges, we kind of categorize them, like the highest impact is for public health. And what does that mean? Well, that means drinking water, even recreation and swimming, in terms of we don't want people swimming if there's high concentration of contaminants. And then a next priority could be economic in nature, or impact is economic, whether it be agricultural yield or other costs. And so that was how our team did it. And I thought it was an interesting way to do it. Does anybody else want to kind of highlight maybe how they did their group a little bit differently and key things they found?
Yeah, this is Ryan. We took a very similar approach where, you know, the number one priority was the health and safety impact. But then we came up with maybe more suggestions, which were along the lines of what Bob just said, which was, you know, be recognizing that one size does not fit all for the entire state of Indiana, and taking into account not only the water use types, but the geologic, physiologic, hydrogeologic differences between the regions. And you know, a lot of the kind of the discussion that's been going on with IFA, and definitely with Sally and others on this call, have been trying to focus on you know, what regions make sense, not only for water planning, but maybe translating into drought planning and drought discussions as well. So I think again, kind of similar themes that everyone else has been talking about so far.
Mm-hmm. Molly and David, did you have anything different that you want to share from your group?
In terms of the prioritizing and sort of how we did that, is that what the question was?
Or anything that you think is important to share that would be beneficial?
Yeah, I think we were kind of focusing more on the overall extent, like the first impacts that were felt in terms of prioritizing, and those that have an economic impact. But Dave, go ahead, and if you want to speak more to that.
No, I think that's where we really ended with, you know, there's some impacts that we see right away that drive other, you know, kind of future impacts, like with the cascading effect to the local economies, you know, from a wider drought area.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't get a chance to talk about challenges, but that the information flow back and forth, you know, getting information from the field and local impacts, and then processing that to the wider, you know, policymaking audience that the agencies deal with, you know, was something that we just touched briefly on.
Okay. I'm seeing quite a few comments in here that, gosh, you know, maybe other people should be, you know, other partners should be in the room. It would have been great to get to know the other people across this entire workshop, as opposed to say, well, who was just in our break, or maybe you would have liked to have gotten to know those in your own breakout sessions a little bit better. That's certainly one of the tough things of doing virtual meetings. But I think if this workshop is deemed a success, or deemed to have enough potential to try and do this again, then when we reach a new normal in our post-pandemic world, I would certainly be open to trying to have more in-person activities like this. Though I think Bob pointed out it would be certainly hard to get everybody in a room for 3 days, or even 2 days. Sometimes there's advantages to, you know, maybe we got more bodies because this was virtual, because we could kind of multitask, or, it's just the morning, so that gave us the afternoon to continue to get work done. I know I like that of a virtual meeting. The critical essential facilities specific to districts at county level that would need their own planning assumptions prioritized. So the person who made that comment, did you want to expand on that a little bit more? I'm talking about the middle yellow one here. And if not, that's okay. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, Beth, that was my comment, Allison, here. So I think I was just reading that more in a more generalized way, so not anything too specific. And I think others could touch on this as well, just noting that all across our state, we're very different, whether it's northern, central, or south. And then even on that district or county level, there's going to be different things that are just more of a priority for them on that level, that we might get fed up and include in the state planning as well.
Okay. This, I say last one, though, maybe it's just the far left bottom one. Does the public care or have awareness of these issues? I know that came up in our group of one of the challenges, if not priorities, I think it was challenge, was education. Not just educating the public of the different types of drought and the cascading effects that drought can have, and the decisions we make as individuals and communities can have a serious impact on others. But what are some mitigation efforts that can be done? How can we all contribute to improving drought? So I don't know if this came up in other groups, or if whoever posted that one wants to expand on that more, what they would have liked to have seen or had discussed.
So this is Ryan. That was mine. And, it's maybe just comes from a series of questions that, I'd always like to ask anytime I go to the audience, which was, raise your hand if you know where your drinking water comes from. Mm-hmm. And, it's amazing that half the people don't know it. It comes from my faucet. Well, that's not what I was asking, really. Uh-huh. And then, that just kind of leads you down the rabbit hole of all the other questions. And, from watershed protection to water availability. And kind of what I'm getting at there is, as a state, and this is a real generic term, but, how do we build a water ethic where people care about water and they value water, and they know, hey, I'm in this watershed and this is an important watershed for these regions, or the importance of groundwater, and is this aquifer sustainable? And, just some of those basic questions that I think, we as water managers would love for other people to be thinking about. So that's I'll get off the soapbox.
One thing that I'd like to add, if possible, is my family used to live in Minnesota, and Minnesota was very heavy on water conservation. When we moved to Indiana, we found that the pricing for our water decreased with the volume of water that we used. So the more we used, the cheaper it got, which is just a complete reverse logic for conservation. And it blew our minds for quite a while, because my father was the type that used to put a brick in the toilet to make sure we didn't use more water than we needed to flush the toilet. So just something to think about. Many of you probably had parents that did the same thing.
Well, I know it came up in our group that, we have different levels of maybe voluntary restrictions and then mandatory restrictions. And that when it's voluntary, people tend to not care. And you also have people that their water is city water, maybe in the urban areas. And so what's the big deal? And yet you have other people in the state that are on well water. And when they run out of water, they run out of water. I mean, they have to figure out how to transport that in. And so I think that there is an unfortunate general ignorance across the state from people who have just always had water when they turned on the tap. And they just really like the look of a good green lawn and their garden vegetables, and are not really thinking from a selfless point of view that this could really have impact on more important things. All right, I want to see, I think there's another question. How could these exercises be translated to more local sub-state workshops that would help improve drought planning and preparedness efforts? So this is another kind of big thinking one, and it's another short answer. But where I'm going with this is, as we do branch out to sub-state workshops in say June and July, do we want to have the participants of those workshops essentially go through these same exercises that we had you all go through? Keeping in mind that we also want you to attend these sub-state workshops as well, because you, in a sense, are leaders in the state. You have a lot of say in statewide decisions and research and analysis. Do you think at a local scale, this is an important exercise for them to do? Or do you think that there's a better way to utilize their time, perhaps in smaller discussion groups, that will be more effective to what we're trying to accomplish? I almost want to put the Jeopardy music on right now. Great ideas. I love this. Mm-hmm. So we have 7 of you so far. 10. Mm-hmm. Oops. I think we have 11 of you so far. For those of you struggling, are there, particular questions that would be useful to ask? So in addition or in lieu of what impacts do you face, what are your biggest challenges, are there other specific questions that, like, I really like Ryan's example, it could be an icebreaker of where does the water come from in your area? Do you really know? Or what sort of mitigation efforts do you do when you know you're in a drought? Okay, so while others are thinking and certainly continue to add in, we'll get down to, let's see. So I saw kind of a similar theme that it might be critical to really think about the participants, the local participants in that workshop so that you can target on them. So I'm seeing things like the geographical distance in the state are significant, understanding the needs of the partners in particular parts of state, identify impact areas that are most relevant to that sub-state area. I certainly like the idea of providing questions ahead of time. It could be questions that they think about, or maybe a survey that they fill out. And that could certainly speed up some time, because it would be nice if these were just 2-day workshops instead of the full 3. We had this one be 3 because we really needed you all to kind of brainstorm and figure out where we're at and where we want to go. Definitely like the idea of providing a summary of what happened in the kickoff meeting so that they know what they're up against. Thinking more about local level planning and engagement, because I do fear that sometimes people at the local levels, no offense to anyone, but might get tired of the folks in Indianapolis always telling them what to do. It's just my assumption. So if they can feel like they are more engaged and have buy-in to it, as opposed to just having to respond to mandates that's coming from the governor's office, might be more effective.
Yeah, I agree with that. I heard some descriptions of the 2012 drought by Central Indiana people saying that it wasn't a significant drought, and I think that's because they don't have a lot of agricultural in Central Indiana. It was a huge agricultural issue. That's my dog having a temper tantrum.
Anyone want to comment on what they posted to provide more context?
I guess I have one question. Mine is towards the top, and I don't know, obviously, from not being within the state, but is it fairly well understood at the state level, like what are the local actions that different entities take to respond or react to drought? And is that important to know?
I think you're on mute, Ryan.
I was just having a sidebar with Manuela.
Okay.
I think the question is, yes, it is important to know. I don't know if I particularly know what those specific plans are. I mean, again, there were recommended ordinances and things that could serve as tools, but then to actually have an accounting of who's actually using those or who has what in place. I don't know if Sarah's still on. There definitely are probably water utility specific plans that are out there that may or may not be integrated in with other local plans. Sorry, Sarah, drug you into the answer. I think another important question for these local meetings is just asking these folks, well, what do you need during drought? I mean, just do you have an inventory of what you really need to respond? And that again probably goes along with some of our partners at DHS and the the local or the county emergency management officials, but just getting them thinking about what they need. They may already know that. That's another good way to engage, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Manuela might have pointed out yesterday that for FEMA eligibility, all the counties needed to have an updated hazard mitigation plan, if that's right. And I don't know if these county level hazard mitigation plans, how much they incorporate drought, but it might be interesting to think, do they? How do they? And how does that interweave with the state and other issues? I have a feeling when they think county mitigation, it's more flooding issues or, other disasters, maybe not so much drought. And because ag is such a big issue in the state, a lot of times ag related disasters from drought is handled through the USDA more so than the state.
And that is very true. The USDA does handle the ag side far more than we would. The important thing is that drought is included. However, it is probably less of a priority at the county levels because of the regularity of the adverse impacts of flood. We don't remember droughts. Our memories are short when it comes to most disasters, but especially for drought because of the severity of impact, unless you were directly impacted because you couldn't do something or you don't remember it very well. Mm-hmm. You just say, oh yeah, my lawn got brown. And I hated the fact that I lost 3 trees out of the deal. But other than that, they really don't think about those impacts beyond that. Again, I think it's because we tend to be a wet state that periodically dries out. But once we have dried out, then to end the drought, we end up with a flood somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so the flood has the bigger memory bank because it impacts a larger sector of the population directly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I am going to go back to my presentation. And so wrap up today. Thank you all again so much for hanging in there through this put the work in workshop, right? Is what we did today. Everything else from yesterday and tomorrow will hopefully be less tedious, but we really appreciate that you helped work through today with us. Tomorrow we'll be back more towards presentation, but more in a show and tell idea as far as really a great series of presenters, I think, that will do almost lightning talks. I don't know if we're officially calling them lightning talks, but just trying to help inform the whole group of what sort of resources are out there, what sort of efforts are taking place. I think Manuela brought up yesterday how there is, when the drought is going on, weekly drought calls with a bunch of partners and other ways that we do really partner across the state and utilize quantitative information and qualitative information to try and really stay proactive to identify, is the drought getting worse? Could it get worse? And so forth. And then after the break, we'll probably focus on, all right, so where do we go from here? And I know we touched on that with our last couple questions today, but in a sense, you all will be considered, in a way, a part of the much broader planning team now for where we go for the next step of how do we disseminate this down to the local level? Where do we want to go in terms of, for future workshops? Do we want to make action items on our plate after this workshop in terms of we seriously want to get this done, or we want to try and prioritize funding or research efforts to look into these problems? So hopefully you'll all return and tell your friends to tune in, and we will then be excited to have that be our day 3. And I will wrap it up there. So if the planning team, do you have any more comments or closing words you want to say before we wave goodbye? All right. Well, have a good rest of the day, everyone. Take care.